Okay. Welcome and thank you for joining us this evening. Tonight we're pleased to welcome David Bowen in conversation about his exhibition On Water, which is on view through June 6th in the Burton and Judy Onofrio galleries here at the Rochester Art Center. We are delighted to showcase David Bowen's work alongside We Are Water MN, an exhibition that helps us understand and make choices about how we interact with water. We Are Water MN was developed by the Minnesota Humanities Center, the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, the Minnesota Historical Society, and the Minnesota Departments of Agriculture, Health, and Natural Resources, and was brought to us with support from Rochester Public Works and Environmental Services. That exhibition is on view through May 9th, and a virtual tour can be found on our website at rochesterartcenter.org. Both David Bowen, On Water, and We Are Water MN are made possible by the voters of Minnesota thanks to a legislative appropriation from the Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund. Now to introduce our special guest, David Bowen is a studio artist and educator whose work has been featured in numerous group and solo exhibitions nationally and internationally. Some of his works are kinetic and often integrate aspects of nature and technology. He is currently an associate professor of sculpture and physical computing at the University of Minnesota, Duluth. Thank you for being here, David.
Thank you, Pam. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you all for coming out. And I look forward to just kind of taking you through a chronological ride here of where I kind of started out and where I am now, what's going on now. So I'm not super great at like checking the text box, but I don't mind being interrupted. Like if you have a question, you feel free to holler. I'll do my best to answer. I'm not really on what I've learned through doing Zoom this past year is I'm not super great at keeping up with that text box. So holler if you have any questions, please. So I'm going to share my screen now, if that's possible. Yep. Okay, great. So here I have a PowerPoint, and I'm just going to go play right through this. There we go. So this first piece that I'm showing here is, as you can see, titled Phototropic Drawing Device. And I would say this is one of the first sort of robotic things that I ever made. It's a small device that has a solar panel, a capacitor, two motors, and two photosensors or photosensing eyes. And basically what happens here is when that solar panel charges the capacitor to a certain level, it tells one of the motors, either the left motor or the right motor, to spin, basically. And that which motor spins is based on which eye, which photosensor sees more light. So there's really no like computer involved with this. It's basically a series of circuits that are wired together to create this function, I suppose. And so this little guy here kind of fits in the palm of your hand. It's a very small robotic device. And in a lot of ways, it's looking for its food because it's powered by light. And so here I have two lights that are arranged side by side, and each one is on for about 10 minutes, and then it'll oscillate. And the device will make its way to the next pool of light that it sees. And as you can see, I've added a piece of soft bind charcoal to it. So each step that it takes is tracked as it goes from light to light. And when it reaches its destination, or the pool of light, it makes these happy little circles and creates these circular drawings there. So here is a drawing that was produced over a period of 4 months with 10 lights that were arranged in a ring, and each light was on for about 10 minutes. And so they behaved in very unrobotic ways, which I thought was the most interesting thing. You know, they kind of made these random choices where they were going across the paper, and you know, the concentration or the density of marks were in particular areas, but millions of marks. The only thing I really had to do was change the charcoal as this was being produced. So this will be the first piece that I ever did using coding or using a computer to create the art piece, I think. Yeah. And this is using a sonar sensor, which is basically an ultrasonic rangefinder that sends out an ultrasonic chirp out into the space. And then it looks for that, bounces off of stuff like people or walls or pedestals, and then comes back to the sensor. And so from there, it can determine a distance. And that distance data is being mapped and then sent to the servo motor here that causes this drawing arm to extend or retract based on how far or close objects are. And as you can see, I added a wax crown to this. There's the sensor. There's a detail of the sensor. And so this makes these circular drawings of not only the space, like the objects and the walls inside the space, very abstract, of course, but also the activity that occurs in the space. So sort of a record of what's happening there. This is all very off-the-shelf stuff. This I started working with the mechanical engineering department at the U of M when I was a grad student there back in 2003 and 2004. And that was where I was introduced to coding and programmable microcontrollers and things like that. So it's kind of where I got to start integrating computers into my art practice. So here's a similar sort of situation, very early microcontroller piece. Originally, I wanted this to be kind of a surveillance unit that would kind of track people as they would go throughout the space. What it's using is infrared sensors. Basically, it's really off-the-shelf stuff. It's the same thing that you use to change your channel on your TV remote. Just kind of hacked that. And data from each of those sensors is mapped to 2 servos that rotate the drawing arm in X and Y direction. And as you can see, instead of a surveillance kind of thing, this really turned into kind of a highly specialized instrument, or kind of an unruly child, I guess. You know, I'm an art school kid, so I'm thinking about like the way our arm makes marks on the page, and thinking about, is it possible for a robot to perform a gestural drawing and that sort of thing. So here, I wanted to start thinking about what was happening over there. So I took those similar sort of design of drawing arm and that same sonar sensor that we looked at earlier. And in this case, we have a sonar sensor array of 4 sensors, one that corresponds to up, down, left, and right. So that's what we have here on my left. And then over here, we have a drawing arm. And this is in Minnesota. These 2 are set up in Minnesota. And these 2, let me pause that. This drawing arm and sensor array is set up in a place called Laboral in the north coast in Gijón, Spain. And this drawing arm and sensor array is set up here, was set up here at the University of Minnesota, Duluth. The sensor array in Minnesota would send data to the drawing arm in Spain and vice versa. So drawings were being produced real time. I guess there was like a 5-second delay, but more or less real time across the Atlantic Ocean. So very gestural, kind of turned into kind of a strange call and response, rudimentary communication system, I suppose.
So these 2, so the one that's in Spain, depending on what people are doing in front of it, is then relaying information to the one in Duluth? Correct.
Yeah, this sensor is sending data to Spain, and this drawing arm is drawing based on the sensor in Spain. Does that make sense?
Wow. So it's like pen pals.
I guess so. Yeah, sure. Very abstract pen pals. Yes. I like it. I never thought of it that way.
Cool.
But that whole idea of what's happening over there kind of comes into a lot of the work in the later years. But just a little digression here. Here I'm using that same sort of drawing arm design, but instead of controlled by people, this is controlled by live houseflies. So here we have 4 sensors, each one that corresponds to up, down, left, right of this drawing arm. And basically they're light sensors. It's kind of a really simple off-the-shelf sensor that gets an amazing amount of data. So it actually can read the shadow of a housefly. So when the flies kind of buzz over or walk on top of those 4 sensors, data from them is mapped and sent to these servo motors that are controlling this drawing arm. So again, very abstract drawings are being produced, in this case by flies. And this was set up at a place in Minneapolis called the Soap Factory back in 2007. And when the fly leaves the chamber, the drawing arm will retract. and the scroll of paper behind it will advance. And the system will wait 24 hours, or excuse me, no, the system will wait until a new fly comes into the chamber to start a new drawing. So, and incidentally, I've sold these drawings, a couple of them. So if anybody's interested, let me know, hit me on email.
That's amazing. And you have another, did you do something similar to that at the Rochester Arts Center previously?
I did. I'll show that one. I think it's coming up right after this one.
Great.
Yeah. So this is I did this residency in this place called Balaton, Hungary in 2006, and I didn't bring any of my tech with. I just kind of decided to bring like a spool of wire and some soldering and iron and charcoal and paper. And I wanted to make what actually turned into a data collector, I suppose. So early thoughts on data visualization, which is something that's getting a lot of buzz or has been lately. So here we have these 3 devices that are set up with charcoal and kind of offset by stones, counterweighted by stones, and then 3 leaves that are being blown around by the wind. And so as the leaf is blown around, it causes the charcoal to kind of make marks on the paper. So these are set up. I set these up every day for the 2 weeks that I was at the residency, and got a great variety of wind data that's obviously very qualified to the mechanism.
It's neat how you've translated what you normally were doing with technology to a completely, simple machine.
Yes, definitely. I mean, this was in one of the early data exhibitions that I participated in. So here's the drawings, and it was actually curated by a person from NASA, Jet Propulsion Laboratory, the people that have the Mars rover, and they're trying to fly the helicopter on Mars right now. This now friend of mine, Dan Goods, curated this data exhibition back in 2008. And with all of my tech work and all the computers and stuff that I was working with, Dan really wanted this one, which I thought was kind of funny, given that's very low tech method of data visualization. So yes, this was the one that was at Rochester Arts Center down there in 2007. So here we have a device that kind of scrolls back and forth behind this pea plant, kind of like a printer. It actually has an old school HP inkjet printer that I hacked, or print inkjet that I hacked. And basically there's a sensor that detects light. And every time that shadow of that pea plant is detected by that sensor, it tells that inkjet to spit out one dot of ink. And so it scrolls in a kind of a raster motion, a very slow raster motion behind the pea plant, and basically draws the shadow of the plant using that inkjet.
And I think you had said in a previous conversation that plant started to wilt.
Yes. Yeah. So I did this upstairs on the 3rd floor there. And they gave me that really long, that 50-foot wall. So maybe this looks familiar, at least the space. And Scott Stuhlin was the curator that I was working with at that time. And it was a 3-month-long show. So we had plenty of wall, and we had a pea plant that we started. And about 2 months into that, Scott gave me a call and said, "Hey, David, the pea plant is dying. What are we going to do?" And we decided to just leave it. So I have this 50-foot long drawing of the entire life cycle of this pea plant, from like a tiny little sprout growing, thriving, and then withering and dying and falling over. That was created down there at the Rochester Arts Center. So this is where I'm currently located, and right on this big, second largest body of water, fresh water in the world, or largest by surface area, and it's just a beautiful landscape. Pam knows it well, and I did a project where I wanted to collect some water data back in 2010. So I hopped on a ferry that went across that lake, that actually went from Upper Michigan to Isle Royal. And I took an old laptop with me, and this laptop had inside of it what's called a rapid drop sensor, which is basically an accelerometer, a thing that measures acceleration in all different axes. And I used some custom software to hack into that rapid drop sensor and to get the data. And I brought that laptop with me as I took a ferry across this big lake. And this is the piece that came out of that. So data from that sensor is being mapped to these 17 individual servo motors that are up above this grid structure that's hanging, and it's hanging by 81 individual points with fishing line. So up above there are 17 servo motors that are moving. So the wave height is determined by the amount of distance that the servo motor moves up and down. And the wave period, the time between the peak and the trough, is determined by a delay that I set in place there. So it recreates the water surface movements as I journeyed across Lake Superior.
That's amazing. We have a couple of joiners, and I just want to let everyone know that you're welcome to interject if you have questions as we're going through interesting stuff.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I don't mind being interrupted. So if anybody has any questions. So this is very much like a marionette. It's kind of controlled from up above, but this is using that data from that journey that I took across the lake. So here we're taking a similar sort of idea, but instead of water, we're using wind. And here I have 150 individual devices that are connected to motors that tilt in X and Y movement. So they tilt X and Y, and there's a plant stock. It's actually tansy connected to each one of those motors. Additionally, there's a plant stock set up outside. And this is actually on the roof of one of the science buildings here at UMD. And inside of the base of this is an accelerometer, a sensor that measures tilt in X and Y. And data from that accelerometer is sent in real time to the field of devices. And I've set this up in a number of different places. It's always very distant. This particular iteration was set up in Bilbao in 2018. So these 150 devices are moving in the gallery space, happening in real time in Duluth, Minnesota.
Was that at the Bilbao Guggenheim?
No, it's it was gosh, what was the name of the venue? No, it was nearby there, but no, I wish, but no.
Pretty impressive.
Yeah, it was a beautiful space that they set it up. It was that Azacuna Zentro in Bilbao, and they commissioned an expansion. I have several versions of that piece. And they expanded it to that larger version. And I think it's something that's infinitely expandable. Next up, we're taking a similar sort of idea to that growth rendering device that we were talking about at Rochester. But instead of making a print of it, we're making a plastic model of the plant. And in this case, it's an onion plant. And this is using an open source DIY 3D printer that I built for the project. And so basically what happens is a couple lasers kind of scan the onion plant. It's actually 3 different lasers scan the onion plant. And whenever the plant is detected by the lasers, this it's kind of like a ultra precise hot glue gun, spits out plastic and builds up one layer after another layer after another layer, a plastic model of that pea plant. So as you can see, they're on a conveyor belt there. And the system we'll print the plant however long it takes, depending on how tall it is. You know, sometimes it'll take 20 minutes, sometimes it'll take 2 hours based on the height. And when it's done, it will advance a conveyor belt. And then it'll wait another 24 hours to produce another print.
Is it the same onion every 24 hours?
Yeah, I left it there and it kind of withered and died a little bit too. So you can see it grows. It grew about an inch or so, a half inch per day.
Yeah, it seems like each 3D print is kind of different.
Yeah, they're pretty, it's a pretty rudimentary 3D printer too. I mean, this is very early stuff. Here's a time lapse. So the prints are not perfect, which I'm down with. I mean, that's kind of part of what I like about it. Like, it's in precision. So here's a time lapse of it printing out the onion, and you can see the advancing conveyor belt there. Just to give you an idea of how it works. So I chose the onions because of how they grow. They kind of grow upright. They don't have like what's called undercuts that kind of leaf out, and so it's easier for the printer to handle, just in terms of making the physical object. So here we have some flies that have an internet persona. This one's titled Fly Tweet, and there is a sphere, acrylic sphere with about 500 living house flies inside of it. And also inside is this fancy Macintosh keyboard here. And there's a camera that's pointed at that keyboard. And I'm using computer vision software to chop that keyboard into each individual key. Each individual key is a little video segment. And so whenever the fly lands on or flies over one of those keys, whatever character is that key is entered into a Twitter box. And when 140 characters are reached, or when the fly triggers the enter key, whatever it is tweeted out. So it's gobbledygook mostly, which, I mean, I don't know. I'm not on Twitter actually. So it's kind of I think this was kind of a critique. And actually the last like 8 years, it's been very, I think, you know, right on, very appropriate, I think, based on Twitter and how it's used. So
did they ever come up with any one word?
No monkeys and typewriters with this one. No, it kind of, but it did actually get a lot of following. If you want to follow it, it's at Fly Colony. I think it was up to like 10,000 followers at one point, which is crazy. But I think there was like a lot of other bots that were following it. But I find Twitter kind of absurd. So I wanted to make something absurd about Twitter. Here we have that similar sort of concept with the, but instead of me going across the ocean, I'm using this National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration has buoys that are all over the world on the surface of the ocean, in the Atlantic, in the Pacific. And so I found one that was in the Central Pacific Ocean, and each buoy has its own website that you can get water temperature, wind speed, wind direction, all kinds of data, including wave height and wave period data. So I made what's called a web scraper, basically some code that goes to that website of that buoy, and got that wave height and wave period data from the buoy. And then I'm mapping that to the structure in the gallery space. So there's 17 individual arms up above there, and each arm moves up and down based on the wave height. And then there's a delay between the movement of each of the arms based on the wave period. So it recreates the water surface. So this was set up, it's been set up several times. In this case, it was in this venue in Marseille, and I'm using data from a buoy in the Central Pacific Ocean.
How similar is that to how water surface works here at the Art Center?
It's very similar. It's actually quite similar. Good point, Pamela. I think that's yeah, really good point. Water surface that's in the gallery space in Rochester is working in a very similar way, where it's using the the wave data and wave height and wave period. Although I can say that the one in the water surface in Rochester is a little bit more complex because it's basically an LED matrix. So I can add more complexity to it. So there's actually 6 pieces of data controlling the water surface in Rochester, where I'm using swell heights and swell period, and then what's called wind wave height and wind wave period. And that's a big wave and a small wave. And often they're coming from different directions. So with that matrix, if you look at it, it can be much more complex because those waves are coming from different directions on different days, which is something I couldn't necessarily do with that mechanism that I just showed. Here, this is kind of political. This is very political, honestly. Here, some flies are in control of a revolver. So inside of this sphere are about 200 living house flies and a camera that's kind of pointed at them. And wherever they go, that's where the gun is aimed. So it's not like the gun is trying to shoot the flies or aim at the flies, but the flies are in control of the gun. The flies are the brain of the robot in this case. So, if they move up or down or left or right, that's where the gun is aimed. So obviously it's very chaotic because it's flies, right? They're determining where it is pointed. So yeah, essentially I wanted to think about the flies as the brain of this system. So yeah, they're determining the direction, and then whenever a fly goes into the center of the camera area, that's when this happens. The trigger is pulled, and that was a blank, obviously, but it's a very tension-inducing piece and somewhat frightening. But I thought it was a statement that needed to be made.
David, how do you make decisions about the organics in your pieces that interact with the robotic technology? How do you choose whether it's wind, whether it's water, or whether it's flies that are interacting with the tech?
Yeah, good question. I think water comes out of wanting to take something that's very fluid and dynamic and turn it into something more mechanical, I suppose, or seeing what happens, I guess, not turn it into, but see what happens when these two things are mashed together. I think just thinking about a natural things that we think of as natural and things that we think of as mechanical. Initially, I'm thinking about a formal contrast between these two sorts of systems. As I work with them more and more, I find them to be pretty, that contrast to not be so clear, I suppose. I find it very interesting when mechanisms or robots or electronic systems kind of screw up or do unexpected things. Likewise, natural systems are things that we associate with chaos. It's not true. I mean, they're very predictable. Plants are amazing engineers. Flies are actually quite predictable in terms of the way they move. So to answer your question, I think it kind of whatever fits the idea that I'm going for. So flies are very much, as you can see throughout the body of work, a stand-in for the absurd, right? And it's kind of unanswered questions or just ridiculousness or frightening in some ways, like we saw with the previous piece. And then water, like I said before, taking a very dynamic fluid system. Wind, I think the tansy stalks really lend themselves to that, just in terms of their physical presence and the way they are activated by the wind. I should say also that that tansy that I use is an invasive here in Minnesota. It's everywhere. I'm sure you guys have it a lot down there too. I find it very beautiful, but it's kind of medicinal. It's got a nice fragrance to it. It's invasive here, but it's not invasive in Europe and in Asia. That's where it's kind of originally from. So, and actually that's where I generally exhibit that piece, is in Europe and Asia, because of the tele-present, which was something that I didn't intend at all, but was kind of a nice little add-on that sort of I realized actually when dealing with customs and shipping things overseas. So anyway, I don't know, there's a couple answers for you. Does that make sense?
Sure, absolutely.
Cool. Well, back to here. Back in 2014, let's see what happened. I was awarded a Minnesota State Arts Board grant and a McKnight Fellowship, both in the same year. So I was like, I'm going to get a lot of equipment, and I got a drone, kind of a fancy drone, sort of a robust drone, and a CNC machine. And I decided to make something that would mash those two together that dealt with water. So I set up a situation where this drone would go to a GPS coordinate over the lake, fixed coordinate. And it would go to that same place, but on different days and different conditions. And it has a little camera on it that looks downward. So there's me with my laptop on the beach, not like most beach goers, but programming that drone to go to a spot. So you can see I'm not, that right next to me there is the remote control, which I'm not holding because it's autonomous. It goes to where you tell it to in a GPS coordinate. And so it's got a camera that looks downward and takes a shot of the water. And then I could use some custom software to convert that water image into what's called a height map or a bump map, where lighter things are closer and darker things are farther away. And that can then, using some more custom software or some open source 3D modeling software, I can convert that over to a 3D model. And then I can generate what's called a tool path for a CNC machine. So basically the path that the CNC machine uses to carve it into some acrylic. And so that is the pieces that are in the RAC gallery right now in the On Water exhibition. So these were produced over, it's always the same location, but it's always different days and different conditions. So the water is very dynamic. So I'm taking this very fluid, dynamic, ever-changing surface and fixing it in 3D form. So these acrylic cylinders are about 6 inches diameter by about 6 inches high. And I believe there's 7 of them down there at Rochester. So if you want to see them in person, go check them out. Some days it was very calm. And even here you can see what's called the tool path. You can actually see these very faint lines where the machine actually carved the acrylic. Here I've given control of a piano over to the clouds. I just kind of wanted to hear what it would what it would sound like for the clouds to play a piano. So I set this one up. So they let me borrow a fancy Steinway at UMD, and I have 88 individual servo motors that are corresponding to each of the individual keys on the piano. And that's the robotic system that's playing the keys. And then there's a camera that's on the roof that's pointed at the sky, and just kind of watching the clouds as they roll past. And so here you can kind of get an idea of what's going on there. I've taken that video of the clouds and chopped it into the 88 individual keys of the piano. So that I'm using computer vision software to kind of chop that into the individual keys. So if a cloud is very intensely over a key, that key is pressed very hard by the servo motor. If it's just kind of halfway like this, it's very lightly touched by the servo motor. Or if it's just blue, then that key's not pressed at all. So it's really, whoops, I hit the wrong thing there. Let's go back. There we go. Apologies. So if it's blue, then that key's not pressed at all. So really the sound that's made, and I really think of this more of a sound piece than music, is determined by the clouds. It also kind of sounds like a cat walking on the piano too. So here we have a much more complex water recreation, much more dynamic. This is using a game controller, actually, this thing called a Microsoft Kinect, which is actually a pretty sophisticated 3D scanner that you can kind of hack into and get data from, get some really cool data from, actually. And that is connected to these 729 servo motors. So here is the Kinect that's set up over a pool cover on Lake Superior. And I'm using the pool cover because the Kinect doesn't bounce off of water very well. So it's bouncing off the plastic. And data from that Kinect is mapped to the 729 individual servo motors in the gallery space. That Kinect creates what's called a point cloud. So this is the point cloud. You can see it's very dense. There's way more than 729 points there. I've just kind of sparsed that point cloud out to recreate the so there you can see that is collecting the data from the movement of the surface of the water. And so I've skipped, I keep hitting the wrong thing, sorry. If I click just slightly off the video, it kind of kicks me out there. So anyway, this was set up at the Minneapolis Art Institute back in 2013 for the Minnesota Artists Exhibition Program. So here we have 729 individual servo motors that are controlled by water surface data that was collected on the surface of Lake Superior using that Kinect that I was talking about. And so again, I'm using a pool cover because it's using infrared that doesn't bounce off the water too well. So the pool cover kind of gives it something to bounce off of. And there's a detailed shot of all those motors. And this was set up at one of the MAEP gallery spaces so that people could walk underneath it. So hence the title, Underwater. So there you can see curator for that space, Christopher Atkins, walking underneath the underwater. So here you can see you can get a much more dynamic, much more complex movement because it's not just based on one fixed point. It's based on thousands of individual points. Here I am tracking some space debris. So this installation is pointing towards the oldest piece of human-made space debris that's currently above the horizon of its location. So I'm tracking about, there's like a 250,000 pieces of space junk that are being tracked right now. But I'm tracking the 10 oldest ones. And so this was set up in Pittsburgh. And whenever that piece of space debris comes above the horizon, all of the twigs will point at it in unison and track it as it goes above the sky or makes a low arc and follow it as it goes either over our head or just when it's in the presence of the space, meaning when it's above the horizon line.
How do you track space junk? Does it have?
There's a website that I was using that tracks basically everything that's up there, all the way back to the oldest thing is. So when that piece of space junk is no longer detected, they all go to a downward pointed position, and they wait till a new one comes above the horizon. But to answer your question, Pam, there's a website where you can track all the way back to, I think 1958 is the oldest thing that's still up. It's called Vanguard 1, which is, Vanguard 1 was one of the US's response to Sputnik. So there's like Sputnik 1 and 2. And then I think, we wanted to get in there. And so we launched Explorer and then Vanguard. And Vanguard was originally supposed to be up there for a lot shorter time, but it ended up going for a lot longer than what it was supposed to. I don't remember the stats off the top of my head right now, but I think it'll be up there for thousands of years. It's not working anymore, but it's a thing that's circling the Earth at 18,000 miles an hour. So they need to track those things because they could potentially be a hazard, I guess, to other satellites, the functioning satellites and things like that. So there is a lot of stuff up there, though, and a lot of old stuff, which I find kind of fascinating that it's just going to be up there indefinitely. I mean, some of these things are going to be up there for millions of years, I'm sure, things that are in very high geosynchronous orbits. Anyway, I'm not going to geek out about that anymore. I want to show you a time lapse so you can kind of get an idea of a 1 hour. Whoop. If I can click on the right place.
Well, by all means, geek out on that. Are you tempted to use
maybe later?
Are you tempted to use that for other things? I know there are some so-called space archaeologists who work to try to make contact or reactivate some of the junk out there. Is that something that you might try to do?
Oh, I'm not familiar with that. That sounds really fascinating. I know Trevor Peglin, the artist, was doing some interesting things with, I don't know about space debris, but like putting artworks into outer space, which was kind of fascinating. But here's a 1 hour time lapse. It just kind of gives you an idea of how these things are moving in the space. And this was commissioned by the Mattress Factory Museum of Contemporary Art in Pittsburgh in 2016. There's a lot of stuff up there. It's kind of disturbing. Speaking of disturbing, here's some more flies. So here I'm thinking about artificial intelligence, and I was reading this book by this author named Nick Bostrom about superintelligence, and back in 2016 thinking a lot about it and how it's kind of becoming more and more pervasive, or we're giving them more control, and all these kind of very utopian or doomsday scenarios, which are very maybe untrue, but pretty fascinating to think about from a sci-fi standpoint. So I was thinking about like the idea that we are giving over a lot of our trust, I guess. I don't know how to say it, but like the idea that AI is very pervasive in our lives and making a lot of decisions for us. So I made this piece where I'm using a pre-trained artificial intelligence model, a pre-trained neural network, to detect flies. And basically what it does is ranks the fly. If it thinks it takes a selfie. So let me play this. If a fly flies in front of the camera takes a fly selfie, and then the algorithm attempts to classify what it sees. Often it's wrong. Right then it said hermit crab. I think it said slug. It's kind of hard to hear the computer voice, but it's often wrong. And when it's wrong, the flies don't get any food or water. So there's the camera. And when the fly flies in front of the camera, or walks in front of the camera in this case, it takes an image.
Classify an image. Thinkum. Thinkum. Image classified. Output score of 100%.
So fly was 98%. So then they get food and water. So their fate is really determined by the proficiency of the algorithm. And they start to kind of hack the system a little bit because they poop everywhere and it kind of like interferes with the camera a little bit. And but they seem to do pretty well. They survived for quite a while. I don't think I had too many flies that didn't make it because they didn't have water. So the algorithm did pretty well at taking care of those flies. I did a residency in Thailand in Phuket in 2018. Sorry, the tornado siren's going off here. You guys too? I think it's like a drill, like a statewide drill, maybe. I don't know. Anyway, I did this residency in Thailand, this digital naturalism conference, and I stayed in this beautiful bungalow on the ocean side there. That's Phuket across the way, and it's an island called Kolom that I'm on. And I took some sensors and hooked them up to some plants. And these are sensors that detect resistance over throughout the plant. That's based on, the water content of the plant, or based on the resistance that's flowing through the leaves, basically. So wind or whatever I like to think what mood the plant's in. And so here's my rig, very, very fancy microcontroller that's water protected. And then I got this really bright light that goes onto my drone. This is a 100-watt LED. And got that hooked up to my drone rig there, which is super intense. There's a nerdy dude looking at a drone. Turns out when you have 100 watts, you need thicker wires. And so I had a few incidents where we had some onboard drone fires, but we were able to safely land the drone, or at least safely kind of crash land the drone. And also the drone, I like thinking about, like, there's a few mishaps with the drone control software. Like sometimes it doesn't know where the hell it is. So we were on the right there in Thailand, and it thought it was, I guess that's at 00. So basically what I did was I took the data from those 3 lily leaves from those sensors and mapped those to latitude, longitude, and then altitude for the drone, and used this software that controls the flight pattern of the drone and created a flight path based on that data. And then we hooked up, we have some LEDs on the drone in this case, and opened up the shutter on a camera. And the drone took that flight. And this was a drawing that was produced. So this sky drawing, I guess, was created by a plant in Thailand. I wanted to take that a little bit further. So I constructed a device that would ride on top of the drone that would carry this philodendron in this case. And so you can see there's a pretty cool guy with some sunglasses there and a philodendron that's about to go for a ride. So I hooked up sensors to that philodendron and mapped it to the drone flight software real time. So then that plant is kind of the pilot of the drone, making very chaotic real-time drawings in this case. Again, setting the drone in motion and then opening up a shutter on a camera to do this kind of skywriting, I guess. There you can see the rig. So you get the 100-watt LED on the front, and then the plant on the riding on top, and some sensors. This was in, I guess this was in Panama in 2019, I suppose. And some very fancy leg warmers on that drone that my niece made for it. She thought it needed some leg warmers. So who am I to argue, right? But that's the rig, and that is collecting data from that plant and then sending it to the controller. And then that data is then sent in real time to the plant. So here's more very chaotic plant piloted drawings that are created.
So David, when
yes.
you make this style of artwork, do you consider yourself to be the artist or originator, or do you consider the plant to be, or are you simply just shedding light, either literally or metaphorically, on natural occurrences that are already there? I guess I'm asking about, your relationship to, like, who is making the art, really, I
like it. I think a lot about that. I think of it as a collaboration between, I'm taking all these things and kind of mashing them together. So, I like to, as you can see, I like to take my hand out of the system as much as I can. That's not always possible. And I'm always fussing, of course, with stuff and trying to get it, obviously I'm making aesthetic choices here, but I like that you asked that, because I like to think of it as a collaboration between the mechanism, the natural input, and myself. And I kind of take these things and put them together and then allow the outcome to happen. And of course, as you can see from the earlier slides, there's always a lot of mishaps and there's a lot of trial and error. And yes, of course, I did, just incidentally, safety is always a thing. I can tell you stories about the gun and how we were very proper in terms of safety with the, I exhibited that in its full form in Vancouver in Canada, where gun laws are very different. And so safety protocols were very different. Likewise with this one, right? Safety is a very big concern here. It turns out you can actually set up what's called a geofence and kind of control how far the drone goes, or say, don't go any farther than this. You cannot control it, but just say, hey, don't go any farther than this. Don't go any lower than this altitude. And then, do whatever. So it is, I guess that's part of it, is composing, right? To answer your question again, on like making choices in terms of, I would prefer that it not go any farther than this because there's trees there and it could crash and that sort of thing. So does that make sense?
Yeah. So an element of control, but maybe a surprise outcome.
I'm always
parameters.
surprised. I think that's what keeps me interested, or keeps me kind of mashing these things together. I mean, I have to have a little bit of control for safety with a lot of these things, but I have so many stories of things that have like just serendipitously happened, because I'm kind of adding these things together, and it's I think that's what keeps me interested, I guess. Sacrificing control, I suppose, or letting it go a little bit. So here we have the other side, and this is all autonomous. This is automated. It's using this worldview map and taking the GPS coordinates on the opposite side of the Earth from where the gallery is at. So this is actually off the southwestern coast of Australia. You can see this is Australia right up here. So this is basically the middle of the ocean. But if you drilled a hole all the way through the Earth, that would be the image that the computer is grabbing. And again, I set this up so that it's all autonomously doing this. So this computer is set up in the gallery space and collecting these images, one every day, of the clouds and the surface of the water, and then using that custom software to convert it over to a bit map, or bump map, and then converting it over to a 3D model, which then sends it to a CNC machine that's hanging upside down in the gallery space. And it's all contained. And the CNC machine will carve out the clouds every day. And then these foam squares are hung in the gallery space. And the participants or gallery goers are invited to touch the other side of the Earth.
What is the medium of those?
It's actually a pink insulation foam, which I love. It's so cool. Yeah, it's just like the stuff that you buy from Home Depot or Menards. I just think it's beautiful and very artificial. Probably not great for the environment either. But in 2019 summer, I was invited to be an artist at sea aboard this ship here, Falcor, as we transited from Portland, Oregon, or Astoria off the coast of Portland to Honolulu. And there's a kind of a image of mid-transit. And one of the things I was kind of thinking about that pink foam now, and sort of feeling guilt about that, using materials like that. One of the things that I was kind of struck by being out in the middle of the Pacific Ocean like this was obviously it's amazing. It's beautiful. It's horizon as far as you can see, but every once in a while there'd be, something that would float past, like a bucket or a flare gun or a piece of rope. And it just kind of stuck with me. So I made this piece, which is right now at the Rochester Art Center as well. This is using data. So again, like that previous tele-present water piece, I'm using the wave data as we transited the Pacific, and then mapping that to these 3 bags that are hanging in the gallery space. So these are moving based on the wave data that I experienced aboard that ship.
And this is one of the pieces that is installed at the Rochester Art Center, and I generated quite a bit of curiosity and interest Thank you for
Can
sharing
imagine.
with us.
Of course.
Did you think about using other debris or junk for this
Actually,
as well?
Yeah, I was actually originally thinking about one of the things I saw. I was up on my favorite place to go was called the Monkey Deck, which was like 3 stories up and just kind of looking, just zoning out. And I saw what I thought was a squirt gun floating in the water. In retrospect, I think it was probably a flare gun, but I kind of got that in my idea. I was like, I want to make a plastic squirt gun that's floating in the gallery. And, after several iterations, I just kind of thought the bags were disturbingly beautiful. I mean, I mean, everybody knows that scene in American Beauty, right? And all my friends give me a hard time, or just kind of, oh yeah, that's American Beauty. I mean, there's something to be said about that. I think, this sort of low mundane, but how they kind of billow and behave in these, it's a very disturbing thing because these freaking bags are everywhere, like especially if you travel. I mean, I think we're doing okay, better here in the US, but other places, Panama, for example, I mean, these bags were everywhere. I mean, it was so so it's just this disturbingly beautiful, I think, is what I was going for. And I don't think the squirt gun was quite as beautiful, I guess. If that makes
There's
sense.
a bag in the tree right behind the art center right now.
They're everywhere. They're everywhere. Yeah.
David, I have a question.
Sure.
So when young visitors come through your exhibition space here in the Rochester Art Center, many times they'll say, "What happens when?" And then they'll finish their sentence, such as the light wave installation. They'll say, "What happens when I stand under it?" Or "What happens if I touch it?" Or "What happens?" And so your installations definitely spark a lot of curiosity amongst visitors. And so I'm curious, do you ever ask yourself questions like what happens when, and then fill in the blank, like what happens when a fly controls a gun? What happens when a cloud plays the piano?
I think that's exactly what I'm doing with all of these, actually, to be honest. What happens when you set up a camera to play a piano? I don't know. Well, let's find out. That's sort of, that's what keeps me interested. I get into a lot of these. Recently did a talk for Schmidt Oceanographic Institute that did the Artist at Sea program. And my point there is that, or I end up in a lot of these conferences where I'm, the artist and there's scientists there, right? And I think scientists are, and so a lot, the question always comes up, like, what's the difference between art and science? And I don't know, but like, maybe scientists' job is to answer questions and my job or artist's job is to ask questions. I love, that's all I do. Really. That's kind of my jam. I think you nailed it.
That.
Yeah. Thank you. Incidentally, also, when they ask about what happens when you go underneath the light, the water surface, well, you're in the best place to be. I mean, that's the greatest place. I highly encourage you to lay down underneath that. I think it's a really great thing to look up at, the wave pieces. Yeah. So this is back aboard Falcor, which anybody that's seen Never Ending Story knows what Falcor is, right? That's what it's named after. And as we were transiting, here's the Pacific, which was just beautiful. There was a sort of protrusion out on the front of the bow of the ship that would kind of cut through the water. It was actually a repurposed German 1980s German Coast Guard vessel. With all kinds of cool instruments on it. And one of the instruments was scanning the seafloor as we went. So I have all of the data. We were using this, it's called multi-beam sonar to scan the seafloor all the way from Astoria, Oregon to Honolulu. And so like 2,500 plus miles of seafloor data, this kind of swath. And there you can see, I think that's the Cascadian, it's called the Cascadian Divergent Zone, where the faults are coming together on the west coast, the northwest of the United States. So I took that data and I came up with actually a workflow, and kind of shared that with Falcor because I hadn't done this before, but that you can imagine that multi-beam that's on board that ship is a very expensive system, and their software is very proprietary, like $10,000 stuff. But basically all it is like an XYZ coordinate, right? But thousands of those, like a point cloud, like we were talking about earlier. So I developed a workflow that would take that data and then get it into my open source stuff, my open source software, and then convert that over to 3D models or STL files. And then I could generate toolpaths from that for a CNC machine. And so these are some early experiments. This is still kind of in progress here. These will actually be at the Minnesota Marine Art Museum down there in Winona next fall. This is a swath of that seafloor that's carved into acrylic with some LEDs that are set up in the base of it. So it's kind of similar to the map that's there at Rochester Art Center too, where that's the actual entire journey on the wall, on the back wall of the space there. And here's a more detailed view. And I've actually exaggerated the data quite a bit. So my aim is to get the entire journey carved in the acrylic someday in larger scale. Here's another view of that.
That's wonderful. This work will be on view at the Marine Art Museum in Winona.
Yes, in fall of 2000. Next October. Next October.
Wonderful. Rochester Art Center members do have reciprocity with that museum.
Awesome,
so
that's great.
Get a
Cool.
discount.
Well, there'll be a lot more dancing bags down there too. They were able to commission like expanding the wilderness piece to 3 times larger, and then also this one, which is a much larger version. I just wanted to take real quick about where I'm at right now. This is what I'm doing all day long in the studio. I'm actually training an artificial intelligence right now to recognize whether or not this plant is happy. So this is very preliminary, not even close. Turns out training AI is pretty hard. So yeah, that's what we're doing. So that is, I think, everything. Thank you. Any more questions?
Is anyone? I had one question.
Sure.
As an educator, has your artistic process been influenced by any of your colleagues or your students?
Sure. I mean, I'm always excited about, sharing my my studio practice with my students, and I hope my enthusiasm comes through in the classroom. But I'm also really, I teach right now actually I teach a physical computing, like I said, in the bio there, but also for the first time, I'm teaching just a creative coding class, and I'm learning along the way, and we're doing it all via Zoom, but it's really fun to see how, and this is me, I guess, right? How non-coders come at it. Like having a little bit more experience coding now. I mean, I'm by no means an expert. I still hack my way through it. However, it is really fun to see like this. I guess that's a little bit of a serendipity too, like how people that are not like engineering, although it's great to work with the engineering kids too. Like it's actually really fun to see how the engineering kids solve art problems and vice versa. So the art kids solving the engineering problems is always pretty great, like creative problem solving all over the place. And yes, I'm always inspired by them, and I love what I do. Trying to get them excited about making new stuff and trying out new things and just kind of mashing stuff together and see what happens. So, yeah.
Cool.
Yeah. Thank you.
And I guess one other question that I had was if kind of like, what are some of the more complicated challenges you've had to encounter or deal with? And, these are such varied technologies.
Just like technically, you mean like just,
Or
yeah.
well, maybe it's not, maybe it's emotional or
No,
psychological.
it turns out AI is pretty hard.
Yeah.
It's a lot of coding. I'm spending a lot of time in front of the computer these days and drawing little boxes around leaves and trying to get the computer smart enough so that it can kind of take over there. But it's there's a reason it's just installing the software. I mean, everything open source is like a little buggy and not super slick, but I love it. I love open source. I love sharing, it's sort of implicit in the code that I use to share. And I think that's great. But it can be very challenging, but I think that's something else, like thinking about students and sharing open source software and things like that. If you're wanting to do something, most likely there's somebody else that's done something similar, and the code is shared online. So you can often find ways to solve your problems just through the community. And I think that's a great resource, especially, as it relates to open source software.
So,
Yeah.
anyone else have any questions for David before we go?
I'll stop my share here.
Chantel, you've been so quiet.
I have a question for you, but it's unrelated to your exhibit, if that's all right
Sure,
with you.
absolutely.
So, as an art student that's trying to get work in galleries, where would you recommend I start?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would look for open calls for calls for entries. If you're kind of a digital artist, there's a great website called rhizome.org, and they have like a community base there where there's constantly calls for entries. Hyperallergic is a good resource for a lot of open calls and things like that. I think it's good to get your work documented, get your work very, very well documented, because it's you need to be able to show people like what the piece is, and so for that reason, you have to put a lot of time and effort into your documentation. I mean, you're not going to be able to go into a gallery and say, hey, I want to do this, and it's going to have one of these, and it's going to do this. You got to have some video, you got to have some documentation, some really good looking images of that for your portfolio, so that you can send that to these open calls and just constantly either have something in a gallery, have something or have something that you're applying to. I think it's key. Just try to keep it going, and rejection is part of it. That's what we all do. It's going to happen. It happens to me all the time. It happens to everybody. That's just kind of part of the game that we have to play. But you just have to keep at it, and if you're persistent, it will pay off. But yeah, documentation and constantly being applying to things. I think those are the two things. Does that make sense?
Thank you.
I guess I didn't really answer your question of where, but I would be looking at, websites like Hyperallergic or Rhizome. If you're a digital artist, be looking at blogs. It's often good to get your work put up on a blog, and then a lot of people see it, depending on the blog, and then you get invitations potentially from that kind of thing, which is also a really good way to do it. Hope that helps. Yeah, good luck.
Great. Well, thank you all for being here tonight. David Bowen on Water is up through June 6th, and the Rochester Art Center is pleased to offer free admission through May 9th in conjunction with We Are Water MN. And we hope you'll have a chance to see both shows. We really appreciate all of your time tonight, David, and for the wonderful presentation. This is really interesting for us, especially seeing how multifaceted your work is. So thank you,
Pam. Yeah. Thank you, everybody. Yeah, it's been great. And we'll be in touch. I guess we'll see you around the 5th.
Can't wait. Yep.
Take it
All
easy.
right. Take care. Bye-bye. Good night.